1. Occam's razor. You're lying in bed at 2 a.m. and you hear a noise downstairs. Your mind immediately constructs an elaborate narrative. Someone picked your lock, disabled your alarm system without triggering it, and is now carefully navigating through your home in the dark. Your heart races, your muscles tense. You reach for your phone, rehearsing what you'll tell the emergency dispatcher. Then you remember, you left the window open, and the wind probably knocked over that precariously stacked pile of magazines you've been meaning to organize for 3 weeks. This is your brain's default setting, not calm assessment, not simple explanation, complexity, drama, the ornate story over the obvious one. At its core, Occam's razor is a preference. When multiple explanations exist for the same phenomenon, the one requiring the fewest assumptions is usually correct. Not always, not guaranteed, just usually. It's named after William of Occam, a 14th century Franciscan friar who never actually used the term razor, but spent considerable intellectual energy arguing that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. In simpler terms, don't add extras when you don't need them. Think of it like packing for a trip. You could bring 17 different outfit combinations to cover every conceivable social scenario, whether pattern, an accidental coffee spill, or you could bring versatile basics that work in multiple contexts. Occam's razor is the voice that says, bring the basics. You probably won't need the tuxedo, the wetsuit, and the medieval night costume all in the same weekend. But here's what makes this mental model so persistently relevant. It works with how reality actually tends to operate. Complex systems, when left alone, tend toward simpler equilibrium states. Water doesn't flow uphill in spirals when it can flow downhill in a straight line. Light doesn't bounce around a room in geometric patterns when it can travel directly to your eye. The universe, despite its vastness and mystery, seems to have a preference for efficiency. Neuroscience backs this up in unexpected ways. Your brain burns roughly 20% of your body's total energy despite representing only 2% of your body weight. That's expensive real estate. So your brain, which evolved under conditions where calories were scarce and predators were abundant, developed shortcuts, heuristics, efficient pathways that get you from question to answer without burning through your metabolic budget. The problem is that these shortcuts, optimized for survival on the savannah, sometimes misfire in the modern world. They generate the complex conspiracy when the simple explanation would do. Consider the historical context in which William of Occam developed this principle. He was living in an era when theological and philosophical arguments had become increasingly baroque, layered with assumption upon assumption, building towers of logic that swayed in the intellectual wind. Occam looked at these structures and asked a simple question: what if we didn't do that? What if we stripped away the unnecessary elements and examined what remained? This wasn't about being reductive. It wasn't about dumbing things down or dismissing genuine complexity. It was about intellectual honesty, about not claiming to know more than you actually know, about not adding ghosts to the machine when the machine works fine without them. In practical terms, Occam's razor shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. Your colleague didn't respond to your email because they're secretly angry at you for that comment you made 3 months ago at the team lunch. Or they're busy and haven't checked their inbox in 6 hours. Your partner's quiet mood isn't a sign of impending relationship collapse. They're probably just tired from a long day. The slight irregularity in your heartbeat isn't necessarily a medical emergency requiring immediate hospitalization. It might be the 3 cups of coffee you had afternoon. But here's where it gets interesting, where the razor cuts both ways. Simplicity isn't the same as ease. The simplest explanation still requires verification, still demands evidence. Occam's razor doesn't tell you what's true, it tells you where to look first. It's a priority system, not a truth detector. Imagine you're a doctor. A patient comes in with a cough. The simplest explanation might be a common cold. Occam's razor suggests you start there, check for the usual symptoms, consider the season, ask about recent exposures. But you don't stop investigating just because a simple explanation exists. You remain open to the possibility that this particular cough, in this particular patient, with this particular constellation of additional symptoms, might indicate something more complex. The razor guides your initial hypothesis. It doesn't replace diagnostic rigor. This is the difference between applying Occam's razor and weaponizing it. Some people use simplicity as a cudgel, dismissing nuance and complexity out of hand. The simplest explanation is always right, they'll say, usually right before explaining why climate science is a hoax or why that pain in their chest definitely isn't worth checking out. But that's not what the razor does. It doesn't eliminate complexity. It establishes a baseline. It says, prove the complex explanation is necessary before you commit to it. In the realm of science, this principle has driven some of humanity's most significant breakthroughs. Before Einstein, explanations for gravity required invisible substances like luminiferous ether that filled all of space and transmitted light waves. The equations worked technically, but they required adding element after element to account for new observations. Einstein's relativity offered a simpler framework. Spacetime itself could curve. No ether needed, fewer assumptions. Greater explanatory power. The same pattern appears in biology. Before Darwin, explanations for the diversity of life required constant divine intervention, separate creation events for each species, intricate plans executed across deep time. Darwin offered something more economical, descent with modification through natural selection. One process, simple rules applied over vast timescales. It didn't answer every question immediately, but it answered many questions with one framework, rather than requiring a separate explanation for each observation. But let's bring this back to you, lying in bed hearing that noise. The value of Occam's razor isn't just in arriving at the correct explanation, that it was wind, not burglars. The value is in what it does to your nervous system. When you default to the complex explanation, your body responds accordingly. Cortisol floods your bloodstream, your heart rate spikes, your digestive system shuts down because who needs to digest food when you might need to fight or flee? This is metabolically expensive. This wears you down. When you train yourself to pause, to consider the simpler explanation first, you're not just being more rational. You're being kinder to your body. You're conserving resources. You're choosing a different relationship with uncertainty. Because here's the thing about uncertainty, it's constant. There will always be noises you can't immediately explain, situations with incomplete information, gaps in your knowledge. You can meet each gap by constructing an elaborate story, or you can start with what's most likely and gather more information before escalating. This is why Occam's razor matters for everyday thinking, not just for philosophers and scientists. Every day you're bombarded with information that requires interpretation. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your boss seems distant in a meeting. A friend doesn't laugh at your joke. Each of these moments is an invitation to explain, to create a narrative that makes sense of the experience. Without a guiding principle, your brain will generate explanations that protect your ego, confirm your existing beliefs, or maximize drama. The person who cut you off is a terrible human being who probably cuts everyone off and definitely doesn't deserve a driver's license. Your boss is clearly disappointed in your performance and possibly planning to fire you. Your friend doesn't find you funny anymore and the friendship is deteriorating. And here's where the razor comes in. The person who cut you off didn't see you because they were checking on a crying child in the backseat. Your boss is distracted by a personal issue that has nothing to do with you. Your friend was distracted by their own thoughts and didn't even register the joke. Simpler, fewer assumptions about malice, conspiracy, or cosmic significance. More alignment with how the world actually tends to work, where most people are dealing with their own stuff and aren't thinking about you nearly as much as you think they are. There's something almost spiritual about this, though Occam himself might appreciate the irony of using that word. When you consistently apply the principle of parsimony, of not multiplying entities beyond necessity, you develop a different relationship with your own mind. You start to notice how often your thoughts add elaborate decorations to simple facts. How often you're not describing reality, but constructing a story about reality. A story that serves some psychological purpose, but may have little connection to what's actually happening. This noticing, this gap between what you know and what you imagine, is where clarity lies. Not in having all the answers, not in reducing everything to simple formulas, but in being honest about what requires a complex explanation and what doesn't. Consider the conspiracy theorist, who is in a way the anti-Occam's razor in human form. They look at a tragedy, an event, a coincidence, and immediately construct an explanation that requires dozens of people to maintain perfect secrecy, to coordinate across organizations and countries, to execute plans with impossible precision, all while leaving just enough clues for the conspiracy theorist to detect the pattern. This is the opposite of parsimony. This is multiplication of entities with wild abandon. But here's the uncomfortable part, you do this too. Maybe not about political conspiracies or global cabals, but about your own life. You construct theories about why your career isn't progressing faster that involve office politics, invisible biases, and other people's hidden agendas. Maybe those factors exist, but maybe, and this is often the simpler explanation, you need to develop specific skills, build specific relationships, or articulate your value more clearly. Less cinematic. Less externally focused, but simpler. The razor cuts both ways, though. Sometimes the complex explanation is correct. Sometimes there is a conspiracy, a hidden illness, a genuine threat. The principle isn't that simplicity always wins. It's that simplicity is where you start. It's the null hypothesis, the baseline against which you measure whether the additional complexity is justified by additional evidence. In medicine, this is called when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. If you're in a location where horses are common and zebras are rare, an unexplained hoofbeat sound probably comes from a horse. But if you're in Africa, if the hoofbeat has an unusual pattern, if there are other signs that don't fit the horse explanation, then you remain open to the zebra. The principle guides your initial assumption without closing your mind to alternative possibilities. This is the balance that makes Occam's razor useful rather than dogmatic. It's probabilistic thinking. It's saying, given what I know about how the world usually works, what's the most likely explanation? And then it's saying, now let me check whether that explanation actually fits the evidence, or whether this situation requires me to consider less likely possibilities. In relationships, this might save you from hours of anxious rumination. Your partner's tone seems off. The simple explanation, they had a difficult day at work. The complex explanation, they're reconsidering the relationship, possibly talking to someone else, definitely hiding something significant. Occam's razor suggests you start with the first explanation. Ask a simple question. Rough day. If the simple explanation fits the response, you've saved yourself from unnecessary anxiety. If it doesn't, if there's a weird deflection or defensiveness that doesn't match a simple rough day scenario, then you have new information that might justify considering more complex explanations. But you started simple. You didn't lead with accusation. You didn't preemptively construct an elaborate narrative. You gathered information efficiently, and you did it in a way that preserved the relationship rather than attacking it. This efficiency matters because you have limited mental resources. Attention is finite. Working memory is constrained. The cognitive load of maintaining complex explanations is substantial. When you default to baroque theories about why things happen, you're spending mental energy that could be directed toward actually addressing problems or enjoying your life. Think about it like your phone's battery. Every app running in the background drains a little power. Every elaborate theory you maintain about why people behave as they do, why events unfold as they unfold, why your life looks the way it looks, each of these is a background app consuming resources. Occam's razor is like closing unnecessary apps. It's conservation. It's making sure your battery lasts through the whole day instead of dying by 2 p.m. Now there's a reasonable objection here, one that needs to be addressed head-on. Doesn't this make you naive? Doesn't this set you up to miss real complexity, real nuance, real problems that require sophisticated understanding? The answer is no, but only if you apply the principle correctly. Occam's razor isn't about being simplistic. It's about being systematic. It's about having a method for prioritizing explanations when multiple explanations are possible. It's the difference between a doctor who dismisses unusual symptoms because it's probably nothing, and a doctor who starts with the most common diagnosis but remains alert to signs that a less common diagnosis might be warranted. The naive person ignores complexity. The person wielding Occam's razor starts with simplicity, but investigates whether that simplicity is sufficient. One is lazy thinking, the other is disciplined thinking. Here's a practical example. You're trying to lose weight. The simple explanation for why you haven't is that you're consuming more calories than you're burning. The complex explanations involve metabolic damage, hormone imbalances, food sensitivities, gut microbiome issues, stress-induced cortisol elevation, sleep deprivation effects, and genetic predispositions. Occam's razor says, start with the simple explanation. Track your calories honestly for 2 weeks. Move more, see what happens. If you're truly in a caloric deficit and you're still not losing weight, then you have evidence that justifies investigating the more complex explanations. But don't start with the thyroid test and the elimination diet. Start with the basics. Most of the time, the basics are sufficient. This isn't dismissive of people with genuine metabolic or hormonal issues. It's respectful of the evidence, which shows that most people underestimate their caloric intake and overestimate their activity level. It's acknowledging what's common before investigating what's rare. In the sciences, this principle is formalized in how we design experiments and evaluate theories. A good scientific theory isn't just one that explains the available evidence. It's one that explains the evidence with the minimum number of assumptions. Two theories might both account for the same observations, but if one requires fewer ad hoc additions, fewer special cases, fewer entities that exist only to make the theory work, that theory is preferred, at least initially. This is how science progresses, not by making explanations more complex, but by finding frameworks that are simultaneously simpler and more powerful. Newton's laws were simpler than the astronomical systems that preceded them. Einstein's relativity was simpler than the modifications bolted onto Newtonian physics to account for new observations. Quantum mechanics, despite its reputation for being bizarre, is mathematically more elegant than classical physics in many contexts. But let's be clear, simpler doesn't mean easier to understand. Einstein's field equations are simple in structure, they're remarkably concise, but they're not simple to comprehend without significant mathematical training. the simplicity Occam's razor seeks isn't about dumbing down. It's about not adding unnecessary elements. It's about respecting the principle that nature doesn't seem to require elaborate machinery when simple mechanisms will do. You can see this in evolution. The eye, often cited as an example of irreducible complexity by those arguing against evolution, is actually a masterclass in parsimony. You don't need a master designer creating the eye whole and complete. You need a simple starting point, a light-sensitive cell that provides some survival advantage, and then you need time, mutation, and selection. The intermediate stages each provide incremental benefits. The pathway from light-sensitive spot to complex eye doesn't require adding mysterious forces or teleological purposes. Simple processes, given enough time, produce what appears complex. This is deeply relevant to how you think about your own life. The complex narratives you construct about why you are the way you are, involving childhood trauma, societal pressures, neurochemical imbalances, karmic debt from past lives, might all have elements of truth. But often, the simpler explanation is sufficient. You do certain things because you've practiced them. You think certain thoughts because you've thought them before, and neural pathways strengthen with use. You feel certain feelings because specific triggers have become associated with specific emotional responses through conditioning. This doesn't mean therapy is useless or that understanding your history doesn't matter. It means you don't necessarily need to excavate every layer of your psyche to change a behavior. Sometimes you just need to practice a different behavior until it becomes the new default, less archaeological, more architectural. Here's where Occam's razor intersects with action. When you're trying to solve a problem, the principle suggests you test the simplest intervention first. You're not sleeping well. The complex explanation might involve circadian rhythm disorders, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, or delayed sleep phase syndrome. The simple explanation: you're on your phone until midnight, drinking coffee at 4 p.m., and your room is too warm. The razor says, fix the simple things first. Get blackout curtains. Stop caffeine after noon. Put your phone in another room an hour before bed. If you do these things consistently for 2 weeks and you're still not sleeping, then you've earned the right to investigate more complex explanations. But you haven't wasted time or money chasing sophisticated solutions to simple problems. This is respectful of your resources, time, money, attention, and it's respectful of the evidence about what usually works. Most sleep problems aren't mysterious disorders, they're behavioral. Most relationship conflicts aren't about deep incompatibility, they're about communication patterns. Most career frustrations aren't about systemic oppression. They're about specific skills or specific blind spots. Now, this is where people get uncomfortable, because it sounds like I'm dismissing real systemic issues, real disorders, real complexity. I'm not. What I'm saying is, don't use complexity as an excuse for inaction. Don't tell yourself your problems are so sophisticated, so unique, so deeply rooted that simple interventions couldn't possibly help. Test the simple thing, see if it works. If it does, you've solved your problem efficiently. If it doesn't, you've gathered information. You've ruled something out. You've earned the justification for investigating the next level of complexity. This is empiricism. This is the scientific method applied to your own life. You're not assuming the simple explanation is correct. You're testing whether it's sufficient. Big difference. There's also something psychologically liberating about this approach. When you default to complex explanations, you often default to explanations that place control outside yourself. It's not that I'm not exercising, it's that I have a metabolic issue that makes weight loss impossible. It's not that I need to work on my communication skills, it's that my workplace is toxic. It's not that I need to practice better sleep hygiene, it's that I have a neurological condition. These explanations, even when they're true, can be disempowering because they locate the problem somewhere you can't reach. But when you start with the simple explanation, you often start with something you can actually influence. You can change your behavior, you can adjust your environment, you can practice a skill. And if the simple interventions don't work, if you genuinely have a metabolic issue or a toxic workplace or a sleep disorder, then at least you've tried the things within your control first. You haven't surrendered to helplessness as your opening move. This is Occam's razor as a bias toward agency, not naive optimism, not toxic positivity, just a systematic preference for testing what you can change before concluding that everything is beyond your influence. In problem solving, this manifests as what engineers call debugging from first principles. When a system isn't working, you don't immediately assume the most exotic failure mode. You check the simple things. Is it plugged in? Is it turned on? Are the connections secure? You move from simple to complex, testing each hypothesis before escalating to the next. Experienced troubleshooters develop an intuition for this, a sense of the hierarchy of likelihood. Novices often do the opposite. They jump to the exotic explanation because it feels more interesting, more impressive. But the expert knows most problems are simple. Most failures happen at the most common failure points. Check those first. This expertise, knowing where to look first, is what Occam's razor formalizes. It's a principle that keeps you from wasting time and resources on low probability explanations before you've eliminated high probability ones. But here's where the razor shows its real power. It's a mental model that improves with use. The more you practice starting with simplicity, the more you develop an intuition for what simple actually means in different contexts. You start to recognize the difference between genuinely simple and simplistic, between parsimonious and reductive. This is a skill, this is cultivated judgment, and like any skill, it requires practice and feedback. You make a hypothesis based on the simplest explanation. You test it, you observe the results, you refine your understanding of what constitutes a sufficient explanation in different domains. Over time, you get better at calibrating. You learn that in certain contexts, maybe in your specific workplace, maybe in your specific relationship, what seems like the simple explanation actually isn't sufficient. You've gathered enough data to know that the baseline is different here. Your prior probabilities shift based on experience. This is Bayesian thinking. You start with a prior, the simplest explanation is usually correct, and you update based on evidence. If evidence consistently shows that simple explanations aren't sufficient in a particular domain, you adjust. You don't abandon the principle, you refine your application of it. For instance, if you're a doctor working in a rare disease clinic, your sense of what constitutes the simplest explanation shifts. When you hear hoofbeats, you think zebras because in your context, zebras are what you usually see. The principle still holds. Prefer the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions, but those assumptions are now built on different base rates. This is sophisticated thinking. This is Occam's razor wielded with precision rather than as a blunt instrument. So what does this mean for you, practically tomorrow morning when you wake up and start making decisions? It means you have a method. When you're faced with something you need to explain, a situation, a feeling, a problem, you pause, you ask, what's the simplest explanation that fits the available evidence? Not the most flattering, not the most interesting, not the one that confirms what you already believe, the simplest. And then you ask, is this explanation sufficient, or is there specific evidence that requires me to consider something more complex? This two-step process, identifying the simple explanation, then checking whether it's adequate, is the razor in action. It's not a rule, it's a habit. And like any habit, it becomes more automatic with practice. If you do this enough, something shifts. You stop generating elaborate theories by default. You stop assuming malice where incompetence suffices. You stop constructing conspiracies where coincidence is enough. Your baseline becomes clearer, calmer, more aligned with how things actually tend to work. This doesn't make you naive. It makes you empirical. It makes you someone who proportions their beliefs to the evidence rather than to their anxiety, their ego, or their need for narrative coherence. And here's the unexpected gift. When you stop defaulting to complexity, you create space, mental space, emotional space. Energy that was previously consumed by maintaining elaborate theories becomes available for other things, for presence, for curiosity, for actually engaging with what's in front of you rather than with your stories about what's in front of you. What felt heavy now starts to move on its own. Before you move to the next mental model, consider subscribing to stay with us as we explore the remaining 99 tools that can transform how you think. Each one, like Occam's razor, isn't just a concept. It's a practice that reshapes your relationship with uncertainty, decision-making, and reality itself. 2. Hanlon's razor. You send a carefully crafted email to a colleague asking for their input on a project. 24 hours pass. Then 48, then 72, no response. Your brain begins its work. They saw it and deliberately chose not to respond. They're undermining you. They want the project to fail. They resent your involvement, possibly because of that comment you made 2 months ago in the meeting. Or maybe it goes deeper. Maybe they've been positioning themselves to take over your responsibilities, and ignoring your email is part of a calculated strategy to make you look incompetent. By day 4, you've constructed an entire political thriller starring your colleague as the antagonist, complete with motivations, allies, and a 3-act structure leading to your professional demise. Then they respond, sorry for the delay, this got buried under vacation emails, thoughts attached. At its core, Hanlon's razor offers you a different starting point. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by carelessness, or incompetence, or distraction, or the basic chaos of human existence. It's named after Robert J. Hanlon, who submitted the maxim to a compilation of jokes and witticisms in 1980, though variations of the concept existed long before. Napoleon Bonaparte allegedly said, "Never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence." Goethe expressed something similar centuries earlier. The specific phrasing changes, but the core insight remains. People are much more likely to mess up than to plot against you. This isn't optimism. This isn't a request that you see the best in people or maintain faith in human goodness. This is probability. This is pattern recognition. This is observing that coordination is hard, that attention is fragmented, that most people are overwhelmed by their own lives and barely have the bandwidth to manage their own chaos, let alone orchestrate yours. Think about your own experience. How many times have you intended to respond to a message and forgotten? How many times have you made a mistake that inconvenienced someone else, not because you were trying to inconvenience them, but because you were tired or rushed or thinking about something else? How many times have you done something that could be interpreted as hostile when you were actually just oblivious? If you've lived any length of time as a human being, the answer is many times, probably more times than you can count. You are on a regular basis the protagonist of someone else's potential malice narrative, except there's no malice. There's just you being human, which means being inconsistent, distractible, and occasionally incompetent despite your best intentions. Hanlon's razor asks you to extend to others the same grace you'd want them to extend to you, not because it's nice, because it's accurate. Here's what the neuroscience tells us: your brain has a negativity bias. It's wired to detect threats more readily than opportunities because, evolutionarily, the cost of missing a threat was death, while the cost of missing an opportunity was just a missed opportunity. Better to assume the rustling in the bushes is a predator even if it's usually just wind. The false positive keeps you alive. The false negative gets you eaten. This bias served your ancestors well on the savannah. It serves you poorly in the modern workplace, in traffic, in text-based communication where tone is ambiguous and delay is common. When information is ambiguous, your brain fills in the gaps, and because of that negativity bias, it tends to fill them in with threat. The person who cut you off in traffic did it on purpose. The colleague who didn't greet you in the hallway is angry about something. The friend who cancelled plans doesn't value your friendship. These narratives feel true because your brain is designed to prioritize threat detection, not accuracy. But here's what's actually happening most of the time. The person who cut you off didn't see you because they were checking their blind spot at the wrong moment. The colleague who didn't greet you was preoccupied with a difficult conversation they just had. The friend who cancelled plans has something going on in their life that has nothing to do with you. Not malice, not conspiracy, just the ordinary friction of existence. Hanlon's razor is a corrective to your brain's threat detection algorithm. It's a manual override that says, before you conclude someone is acting against you, consider whether they might just be acting without thinking about you at all, which, if you're honest, is what you do most of the time too. This is harder than it sounds because the malice narrative serves psychological purposes. It gives you someone to blame. It externalizes your frustration. It creates a story where you're the protagonist being wronged, which is somehow more tolerable than being a minor character in someone else's story where you barely register. When your boss doesn't acknowledge your contribution in the meeting, you can tell yourself they're threatened by your competence, deliberately minimizing your role to preserve their own status. This narrative, while painful, at least grants you significance. The alternative, that your boss was distracted, or didn't think the contribution was as substantial as you did, or genuinely forgot in the moment, is somehow more deflating because it suggests you don't occupy as much space in their awareness as you occupy in your own. But deflating though it may be, it's usually more accurate. You are not the center of most people's attention. You are not the focus of their scheming. You are at best a peripheral character in their overwhelmingly self-centered inner narrative, just as they are in yours. Hanlon's razor confronts you with this reality. Most of the things that feel personal aren't. Most of the slights you've experienced weren't intentional. Most of the ways you've been inconvenienced or overlooked or frustrated by others weren't orchestrated. They were accidental byproducts of people navigating their own complexity. This realization can be oddly freeing. If the problem isn't malice, it's solvable through different means. You don't need to defend yourself against an attack because there's no attack. You don't need to outmaneuver a scheme because there's no scheme. You need to communicate more clearly or adjust your expectations or recognize that the friction you're experiencing is just the normal static of human interaction. Consider the last time you felt genuinely wronged by someone, not physically harmed, but slighted, disrespected, undermined. Now consider, what percentage of that wrong was actually intentional? What percentage was someone acting without thinking about how it would affect you? What percentage was someone dealing with their own limitations and not successfully managing the spillover? If you're honest, the malicious percentage is probably smaller than it felt in the moment. Much smaller. This doesn't mean malice never happens. It does. There are people who deliberately harm others. There are betrayals, manipulations, calculated cruelties. Hanlon's razor isn't about denying that reality. It's about not making malice your default assumption. It's about treating malice as the hypothesis that requires evidence, not the conclusion you leap to when something goes wrong. The practical application looks like this. Something happens that could be explained either by malice or by mistake. Your first move isn't to assume the worst. Your first move is to gather information. You ask a clarifying question. You observe a pattern over time. You test whether the behavior changes when you address it directly. If you confront every potential slight as though it were an intentional attack, you damage relationships that might have been preserved with a lighter touch. You create conflict where there was only confusion. You exhaust yourself fighting battles that didn't need to be fought. But if you start with the assumption of mistake rather than malice, you create space for repair. Hey, I noticed you didn't include me in that email thread. Was that intentional, or did I get left off by accident? This question, asked with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, usually gets you an answer. And usually that answer reveals an oversight, not a plot. There's a social dimension to this that matters. When you consistently attribute negative outcomes to malice, you become someone who sees enemies everywhere. Your colleagues learn to walk on eggshells around you because any mistake might be interpreted as an attack. Your friends gradually distance themselves because the cognitive and emotional labor of managing your sensitivity becomes exhausting. But when you embody Hanlon's razor, when you consistently give people the benefit of the doubt and assume mistakes rather than malice, you become someone who's easy to work with. Someone who doesn't escalate. Someone who doesn't turn every friction point into a referendum on the relationship. This doesn't make you a doormat. You can still set boundaries. You can still address patterns of behavior that affect you negatively, but you do it from a frame of problem solving rather than combat. I've noticed this thing keeps happening and it's creating problems for me. Can we figure out a way to prevent it? Is very different from you keep doing this thing to me and I know it's deliberate. One invites collaboration, the other invites defensiveness. Here's where it connects to organizations and systems. Bureaucracies feel malicious. When you're trapped in a Kafkaesque loop of forms and departments and representatives who can't help you, it's natural to conclude that the system is designed to frustrate you. That someone somewhere created this nightmare deliberately to make your life harder. But apply Hanlon's razor and a different picture emerges. The system isn't designed to frustrate you. It's probably not designed at all, at least not in any coherent sense. It's an accumulation, rule added to rule, department added to department. Each addition made sense at the time to the person who made it, solving some specific problem or addressing some specific need. But the aggregate effect, the system that results from decades of these individual additions, is incoherent. Incompetent, not malicious. This matters because it changes how you engage with systems. If you believe the system is malicious, you fight it. You get angry. You demand to speak to supervisors. You personalize the interaction with the representative who's trying to help you, as though they are the embodiment of the conspiracy against you. But if you understand the system is incompetent, a Rube Goldberg machine of historical decisions that no longer make sense together, you approach it differently. You work around it. You find the workarounds. You recognize that the person on the other end of the phone is also trapped in the machine, probably more frustrated by it than you are because they deal with it every day. You become strategic rather than combative, and you usually get better results. There's a concept in software development called assume good intent. It's a cultural principle that says when someone submits code that breaks something or proposes an idea that seems problematic, you start from the assumption that they were trying to help. They weren't sabotaging the project. They weren't being careless on purpose. They saw a problem and attempted a solution, and it didn't work, but the intent was constructive. This principle exists because the alternative, assuming bad intent, makes collaboration impossible. If every mistake is treated as an attack, people stop taking risks. They stop proposing solutions. They become so focused on not being blamed that they stop trying to help. Hanlon's razor is assume good intent, generalized beyond software development to all of human interaction. It's recognizing that most people, most of the time, are doing their best with the information and resources they have. And sometimes their best isn't very good. Sometimes their best creates problems for you, but it's still not malicious. It's just limited. Now, let's address the obvious objection. Doesn't this make you vulnerable? Doesn't this set you up to be taken advantage of by people who are actually acting with malice? The answer is it can, if you apply it dogmatically, but that's true of any mental model. The point isn't to never recognize malice. The point is to not see it where it doesn't exist, to make it the conclusion you arrive at after evidence, not the assumption you start with. In practice, this means you give people one chance. Maybe two, to demonstrate that their behavior is a mistake rather than a pattern. If someone consistently acts in ways that harm you, if they show no responsiveness when you address the behavior directly, If there's a clear benefit to them from the harm they're causing you, then you update your model. You move from "this is probably incompetence" to "this might actually be malice." But even then, you remain open to alternative explanations. Maybe it's not malice. Maybe it's indifference, which can be just as damaging but requires a different response. Maybe it's a values mismatch, where what they see as acceptable behavior strikes you as harmful. Maybe it's a fundamental incompatibility that doesn't need to be framed in moral terms at all. The point is, you don't leap to the darkest interpretation as your opening move. You escalate your interpretation as the evidence accumulates. This is proportional response. This is calibrated thinking. There's also a self-fulfilling prophecy dimension here. When you treat someone as though they're acting with malice, they often respond defensively. They might even start acting in ways that confirm your suspicion, not because they were malicious to begin with, but because being treated as an enemy makes people behave like enemies. But when you treat someone as though they made a mistake, as though they're fundamentally reasonable and well-intentioned, but sometimes careless or overwhelmed, they often rise to meet that expectation. They apologize, they correct, they try harder next time. You've given them a path to repair that doesn't require them to defend their character. This is practical psychology. This is understanding that people generally move toward the version of themselves you expect them to be. Not always, not in every case, but often enough that it's worth making the better assumption first. Let's bring this into the realm of politics and public discourse, where Hanlon's razor becomes both more important and more difficult to apply. When a politician proposes a policy you find abhorrent, the easy move is to assume malice. They want to harm the people you care about. They're corrupt. They're evil. Sometimes this is true, but often the more accurate explanation is that they have a different model of how the world works. They genuinely believe their policy will produce good outcomes. They're wrong, perhaps catastrophically wrong, but they're not deliberately trying to cause harm. They're incompetent in their analysis, or they're prioritizing different values, or they're captured by a flawed ideology. This distinction matters because it changes how you engage. If someone is malicious, there's no point in dialogue. You simply oppose them. But if someone is wrong but well-intentioned, there's at least the possibility of persuasion, of finding common ground, of addressing the root of the disagreement rather than treating the person as irredeemable. This doesn't mean you have infinite patience for harmful policies. It means you distinguish between the policy and the person. You oppose the policy vigorously while maintaining the possibility that the person could be reached with better information, better framing, better arguments. Is this always possible? No. Is it always productive? No, but it's more likely to be productive than assuming everyone who disagrees with you is acting from dark motives. In your personal life, Hanlon's razor might save your relationships. When your partner forgets something important, when your friend is late again, when your family member says something hurtful, your first question should be, was this intentional, or was this a failure of attention, awareness, or skill? Most of the time, it's the latter. People forget because they're overwhelmed. They're late because they're bad at time management. They say hurtful things because they lack emotional intelligence or because they're stressed and their filters are down. None of this makes the impact less real, but it changes the appropriate response. Instead of "you don't care about me," which is an attribution of malice, you might say, "When you forget things that are important to me, I feel like I'm not a priority." This addresses the impact without making it about intent. It gives the other person room to acknowledge the harm and commit to doing better without having to defend themselves against an accusation of not caring. This is how you maintain relationships through inevitable human imperfection. You create space for people to fail without making every failure a moral indictment. But here's the deeper gift of Hanlon's razor. It reduces your suffering. When you attribute negative outcomes to malice, you carry resentment. You replay the incident in your mind. You imagine confrontations. You build case files in your head against people who probably aren't thinking about you at all. This is exhausting. This is corrosive. This is giving your mental and emotional energy to narratives that aren't serving you. When you attribute negative outcomes to incompetence or mistake, you might still be frustrated, but the frustration is cleaner. It's directed at the situation, not the person. It's about solving the problem, not punishing the perpetrator. And it dissipates faster because there's no ongoing narrative of victimization to maintain. You move through the world lighter, less defended, less convinced that everyone is out to get you. And paradoxically, this makes you more effective because you're not wasting energy on shadow boxing with imagined adversaries. There's also something here about humility. When you apply Hanlon's razor, you're implicitly acknowledging your own capacity for the same failures. You're admitting that you too are sometimes careless, sometimes incompetent, sometimes so caught up in your own concerns that you accidentally harm others. This isn't self-flagellation. This is honest accounting. And it makes you gentler with yourself when you inevitably make mistakes, because you've established a framework where mistakes are expected, normal, forgivable parts of being human rather than evidence of moral failure. So the razor cuts both ways. It makes you more generous with others and more compassionate with yourself. It lowers the stakes of everyday interaction by removing the moral weight from most negative outcomes. Now combining Hanlon's razor with Occam's razor creates something powerful. Occam's razor says, prefer the simplest explanation. Hanlon's razor says, when choosing between malice and mistake, prefer mistake. Together, they create a default stance toward the world that is both rational and merciful. When something goes wrong, you don't immediately construct elaborate theories about conspiracies and plots. You don't attribute to malice what can be explained by ordinary human limitation. You start with the simple, non-malicious explanation and only add complexity or malice when the evidence truly demands it. This doesn't make you naive, it makes you proportional. It makes you someone who responds to reality rather than to your fears about reality. And it makes you someone who conserves mental and emotional resources for the problems that actually require them. What you discover when you practice this consistently is that most of what you thought was personal wasn't. Most of what you thought was intentional wasn't. Most of what you thought required you to defend yourself or strike back or withdraw and hurt didn't require any of those things. It just required you to recognize that people are messy, distracted, limited creatures doing their best in complicated circumstances. Just like you. 3. First principles thinking. You're sitting in a meeting where someone proposes solving a problem the way it's always been solved. This is how we've done it for years, they say, as though longevity were evidence of quality rather than just evidence of repetition. Everyone nods. The proposal moves forward. You feel a vague unease but can't articulate why, so you stay silent. 3 months later, the solution fails in predictable ways, and someone says, "Well, we tried," as though the attempt itself were the point rather than the outcome. This is what happens when you accept inherited frameworks without question, when you mistake familiarity for truth, when you build on foundations you've never examined. First principles thinking is the practice of breaking down a problem to its most basic, foundational truths and rebuilding from there. Not from what's always been done, not from what everyone assumes, from what's actually, demonstrably true. The term comes from Aristotle, who described a first principle as the first basis from which a thing is known. It's the bedrock, the axiom, the thing that cannot be deduced from anything else because it's the thing from which other things are deduced. In practice, it means asking why until you hit something that can't be reduced further. It means refusing to accept because that's how it's done as an answer. It means being willing to question everything except the laws of physics and mathematics, and even then, understanding that your interpretation of those laws might be flawed. Elon Musk talks about this constantly, to the point where it's almost become a cliché, but the cliché exists because the principle is powerful. He wanted to build rockets, but rockets were expensive. NASA was spending something like $65 million per launch. Everyone in the industry accepted this as just the cost of rocketry. The conventional wisdom was, rockets are expensive, therefore space travel is expensive, therefore Mars colonization is impossible. Musk applied first principles thinking. He asked, what is a rocket actually? It's aluminum, titanium, copper, carbon fiber. What do those materials cost on the commodity market? He did the math. The raw materials for a rocket cost maybe 2% of the typical rocket price. So the question shifted. It wasn't how do we afford expensive rockets? It was why are rockets expensive if the materials are cheap? The answer, because of how they're manufactured, because of the supply chain, because of the lack of reusability, because of institutional inertia in the aerospace industry. Once you identify that the cost isn't inherent to the physics but to the approach, you can design a different approach. You can build rockets that land themselves and get reused. You can vertically integrate manufacturing. You can question every assumption about how rocket companies operate. This is first principles thinking in action. You don't accept the problem as presented. You deconstruct it until you understand what's actually true versus what's just accumulated convention. But you don't have to be building rockets for this to matter. You apply the same method to your own life every time you pause to ask whether the way you're doing something is the way it needs to be done, or just the way you've always done it. Consider your morning routine. Maybe you wake up, immediately check your phone, scroll through news and social media for 20 minutes, feel vaguely anxious, then rush through getting ready for work. You've done this for years. It feels inevitable, like this is just what mornings are. First principles thinking asks, what is a morning fundamentally? It's the transition from sleep to wakefulness. What does your body actually need during this transition? time for cortisol to naturally rise, hydration after hours without water, movement to activate your systems, probably not immediate exposure to algorithmically optimized outrage and status comparison. So you rebuild. Maybe you wake up, drink water, move your body for 10 minutes, then ease into the day. You've questioned the inherited structure and built something based on actual human physiology rather than on habit and device addiction. This sounds simple, but it's not, because first principles thinking requires you to hold your own beliefs and behaviors with the same skepticism you'd apply to strangers. It requires intellectual honesty at a level most people find uncomfortable. Here's why: most of what you believe because you absorbed it. From parents, from culture, from education, from the random accumulation of experiences that shaped your development. Very few of your beliefs were consciously chosen after rigorous examination. Most of them are defaults. And defaults serve a purpose. They're efficient. You can't question everything all the time or you'd never get anything done. But the problem with defaults is that they calcify. They become invisible. You stop seeing them as choices and start seeing them as reality. First principles thinking makes the invisible visible again. It turns defaults back into choices. And that can be destabilizing because suddenly everything is up for examination, including things you built your identity around. Let's take something concrete: your career. Maybe you're in a field you chose 20 years ago based on what seemed practical at the time, or what your parents approved of, or what the job market demanded. You've accumulated expertise, reputation, professional relationships. You have golden handcuffs. The longer you stay, the harder it is to leave. First principles thinking asks, what do you actually want from work? Not what you should want, not what would make other people proud. What do you want? Maybe the answer is enough money to live comfortably, work that feels meaningful, time for relationships and interests outside of work, a sense of contributing something useful to the world. Now you compare that to your current situation. Does your job provide those things? If yes, you've validated your choice. If no, you have to ask, why are you still doing this? And the answer is usually some version of, because I've already invested so much, because it's what I know, because change is scary, because this is who I am now. None of those are first principles reasons. Those are sunk cost fallacies and identity protection and risk aversion. Those are the barnacles that accumulate on decision-making over time. The first principles approach says, if you were starting from zero today, with what you now know about yourself and the world, would you choose this path? If the answer is no, then the only question that matters is, what would you choose instead, and what's the smallest step you could take toward that? This is terrifying for most people, because it suggests that years of your life might have been based on faulty premises. That the story you tell about who you are might need revision. That you might need to admit you were wrong, not about some trivial thing, but about something central to your existence. But here's the thing, you were working with the information you had at the time. Past you made the best decision past you could make, but present you has more information. Present you knows things past you didn't. Refusing to update based on new information isn't loyalty to your past self, it's just stubbornness. First principles thinking is permission to change your mind, to rebuild, to acknowledge that foundations you accepted without examination might not support the life you actually want to build. In mathematics and logic, this kind of thinking is formalized. You start with axioms, statements accepted as true without proof because they're self-evident or definitional. Then you build theorems on top of those axioms using valid logical operations. If you start with faulty axioms, everything you build on top of them is suspect, no matter how rigorous your reasoning. Euclid built geometry this way, 5 postulates from which he derived an entire mathematical system. For 2,000 years, one of those postulates, the parallel postulate, bothered mathematicians because it seemed less self-evident than the others. Eventually, mathematicians questioned it. What happens if we change this axiom? The result, non-Euclidean geometry. Entirely new mathematical systems that are just as valid as Euclidean geometry, but built on different foundations. And it turns out these non-Euclidean systems better describe curved spaces, like the surface of a sphere or the fabric of spacetime in general relativity. The point is, changing your foundational assumptions doesn't just modify your conclusions. It opens up entirely new possibility spaces, regions of the map you couldn't even see when you were working from the old axioms. This applies to your personal axioms too. Maybe you've built your life on the assumption that security is paramount, that the right way to live is to minimize risk, accumulate safety margins, never make bold moves that could result in loss. This axiom might come from growing up with financial instability, or from temperament, or from cultural messaging about responsibility. From this axiom, you've derived a whole life, a stable job you don't love, savings you don't touch, opportunities you don't take because they involve risk, relationships you maintain because they're comfortable even if they're not fulfilling. First principles thinking asks, is security actually paramount, or is it one value among many? What if you built your life on a different foundation, say, growth or contribution or experience? You don't have to change anything, but you should know that you're choosing the foundation, not discovering it, that these aren't universal truths. They're your axioms, and axioms can be examined and, if necessary, replaced. In business, first principles thinking is what separates innovation from iteration. Iteration is making the existing thing slightly better. Innovation is questioning whether the existing thing should exist at all. Netflix is a good example. Blockbuster iterated on video rental, bigger stores, more selection, better locations. Netflix went to first principles. What do people actually want? They want to watch movies at home without effort or hassle. Driving to a store, browsing physical shelves, remembering to return tapes on time, all of that is friction. What if you removed the friction? Mail order DVDs, then streaming. The physical store wasn't fundamental to movie watching. It was just the implementation everyone had accepted. Netflix questioned the implementation and built something better. You can apply this to any process you're stuck in. Don't ask, how do I do this task faster? Ask, does this task need to be done at all? What's the actual goal, and is there a completely different way to achieve it? Most meetings, for instance, don't need to be meetings. The goal is usually information transfer or decision-making. Information transfer can happen asynchronously through documents. Decision-making can happen through structured frameworks that don't require synchronous time. But we have meetings because that's what organizations do, and questioning whether meetings are necessary feels somehow subversive. First principles thinking is subversive. That's the point. It subverts unexamined assumptions. It subverts inherited wisdom that might not be wise. It subverts the tyranny of that's how it's always been done. But it's also exhausting if you do it constantly. You can't rebuild everything from scratch every day. At some point, you need to trust that some decisions have been made correctly and can be left alone. The skill is knowing when to apply first principles thinking and when to accept conventional approaches. If a problem keeps recurring, if a solution consistently underperforms, if you feel chronic dissatisfaction with an area of your life, those are signals to go to first principles, to stop patching and start rebuilding. But if something works, if it serves its purpose efficiently, if it's not causing problems, maybe just let it be. Not everything needs to be optimized from foundational axioms. There's also a social cost to being the person who constantly questions everything. People find it exhausting. You become the person who derails meetings by asking, but why are we doing this? When everyone else just wants to execute the plan and go home. So there's a balance. You need to pick your moments. Apply first principles thinking to things that matter, where the potential upside of finding a better approach justifies the friction of questioning the current approach. This connects back to Occam's razor in an interesting way. First principles thinking can lead you to complex solutions if you're not careful, because once you've deconstructed everything, you might feel compelled to reconstruct it with maximum sophistication. But the simplest solution that addresses the fundamental requirements is usually the right one. So you go to first principles to understand what you're actually solving for. Then you apply Occam's razor to build the simplest thing that satisfies those requirements. You don't add features just because you can. You don't overcomplicate just to demonstrate your understanding of the principles. Elegance is simplicity built on deep understanding. That's what you're aiming for. Here's a personal example: sleep. The conventional approach to sleep problems is to address symptoms. You can't fall asleep, so you take melatonin. You wake up tired, so you drink coffee. You're anxious at night, so you take sedatives. First principles thinking asks, what is sleep fundamentally? It's a biological process driven by circadian rhythms, influenced by light exposure, temperature, activity patterns, stress hormones, and dozens of other factors. It evolved over millions of years in environments very different from modern bedrooms filled with screens and artificial light. So instead of treating symptoms, you address the underlying mechanisms. You align your light exposure with natural patterns: bright light in the morning, darkness at night. You cool your room because your body temperature needs to drop to initiate sleep. You create consistent sleep-wake times because your circadian system thrives on regularity. You manage stress and caffeine because they affect the neurochemical environment required for sleep. This is harder than taking a pill. It requires understanding and addressing multiple factors. But it works better because it's built on what sleep actually is rather than on what pharmaceutical companies can sell you. The same pattern applies to almost any problem. The surface-level solution treats symptoms. The first principles solution addresses root causes. and root causes usually involve understanding the fundamental nature of the thing you're trying to affect. In physics, this is explicit. Feynman was famous for being able to derive complex equations from first principles during lectures. He didn't memorize formulas. He understood the underlying physics deeply enough that he could rebuild the formulas on the spot from basic relationships like F equals ma or conservation of energy. This is the gold standard, understanding something so thoroughly that you could reconstruct it if all your notes disappeared. If you can't do that, you're operating on borrowed knowledge, and borrowed knowledge is fragile. It works until it doesn't, and when it breaks, you have no idea how to fix it because you never understood what held it together. So first principles thinking is also a test of understanding. If you can't break something down to its fundamental components and rebuild it, you don't really understand it. You've just memorized someone else's conclusions. This is uncomfortable to realize because it means you don't actually understand most of what you think you understand. You know facts, you know procedures, you know what smart people have said about things, but how much of that could you derive yourself if you had to? Probably less than you'd like to admit. And that's fine, you don't need to derive everything. But for the things that matter, the things you base important decisions on, the things you stake your life on, you should probably understand them from first principles. Because if those foundations are wrong, everything built on them is suspect. What this gives you ultimately is agency. When you accept inherited frameworks, you're playing a game designed by other people with rules you didn't choose. When you build from first principles, you design your own game with rules that actually serve your goals. This doesn't mean you ignore tradition or expertise. It means you evaluate them. You ask, why does this tradition exist? What problem was it solving? Is that problem still relevant? Does this solution still work, or is there a better way now that circumstances have changed? Most traditions exist because they solved real problems, but the problems they solved might not be your problems. The constraints they operated under might not be your constraints, and the solutions that worked then might not be optimal now. So you honor the wisdom in tradition while remaining free to adapt or abandon it when it no longer serves. You respect expertise while understanding that experts can be captured by their own frameworks, unable to see outside the paradigm they've mastered. First principles thinking keeps you free to question, free to rebuild, free to find better ways even when better ways aren't supposed to exist. The wind that knocked over your magazines wasn't malicious. The person who didn't email you back wasn't plotting, and the way you've always done things isn't the only way to do them. These are the foundations, now you build. 4. Inversion. You're trying to figure out how to be happy. You read books about happiness. You listen to podcasts about happiness. You make lists of things happy people do, gratitude journals, meditation, exercise, meaningful relationships, purposeful work. You try to implement these things. Some days you succeed, most days you don't. The happiness remains elusive, always just slightly out of reach, like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you wake. Here's a different question: what makes you miserable? That one's easier to answer. Scrolling social media before bed, saying yes to commitments you don't want, staying in conversations that drain you, eating food that makes you feel terrible, avoiding difficult conversations until they become crises, comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. Inversion is the practice of approaching problems backward. Instead of asking, how do I achieve X? You ask, how do I avoid not X? Instead of how do I succeed? You ask, how do I avoid failure? Instead of trying to add positive things, you identify and remove negative things. The mathematician Carl Gustav Jacobi used to tell his students, invert, always invert, when they got stuck on problems. He understood that sometimes the path forward is clearer when you're walking backward, that the obstacles are more visible when you're trying to avoid them than when you're trying to transcend them. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner, built much of his investment philosophy on inversion. He doesn't primarily ask, what will make this company successful? He asks, what could destroy this company? The companies that are hardest to destroy, those with wide moats, strong balance sheets, resilient business models, those are the ones worth owning. This isn't pessimism. This is clearing the path. It's recognizing that removing obstacles is often easier and more effective than building elaborate strategies to overcome them. Think about your health, the positive approach. I need to eat perfectly, exercise optimally, sleep exactly 8 hours, manage stress through meditation, take supplements, track biomarkers, optimize everything. This is exhausting. The bar is so high that falling short feels like failure, and failure tends to cascade into abandonment. Inversion asks, what are you doing that's actively making you unhealthy? Drinking too much, eating processed food that makes you feel awful, staying sedentary for 12 hours a day, getting 4 hours of sleep because you're watching Netflix until 2 a.m. Stop doing those things, just stop. You don't need to be optimal. You need to stop being actively harmful to yourself. And often, when you remove the negative behaviors, the positive outcomes emerge naturally without force. Your body wants to be healthy, it's built for health, but you keep sabotaging it with behaviors that work against your physiology. Remove the sabotage, and health isn't something you have to strain toward. It's just what happens when you stop preventing it. This applies to relationships too. The positive approach: be more loving, more present, more communicative, more thoughtful, more generous, more emotionally available. All good things, all true things, but also exhausting in their demand for constant addition. Inversion asks, what are you doing that damages your relationships? Checking your phone when someone's talking to you, making promises you don't keep, criticizing more than you appreciate, withdrawing when you're upset instead of communicating, bringing up past grievances during current conflicts. Stop doing those things, just stop. You don't need to be a relationship guru. You need to stop doing the things that erode trust and connection. And when you stop eroding, growth becomes possible without forcing it. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't primarily focus on achieving virtue. They focused on avoiding vice. Marcus Aurelius wrote constantly about what not to do. Don't gossip, don't complain, don't seek approval, don't waste time on things that don't matter. The positive virtues, courage, wisdom, justice, temperance, emerged from the space created by removing their opposites. In medicine, this is formalized in the principle: first, do no harm. Before you intervene, before you add treatments and procedures and medications, make sure you're not making things worse. Make sure the intervention is better than letting the body heal itself. Many medical errors come from overtreatment, from doing too much rather than too little. Your immune system is sophisticated. It's been refined over millions of years. Often, the best thing a doctor can do is remove obstacles to healing rather than imposing healing through force. Stop the infection, stabilize the patient, then get out of the way and let the body do what it knows how to do. This is harder than it sounds because we're action-biased. We want to do something. Doing nothing, even when nothing is the right move, feels irresponsible. So we intervene, we add, we complicate, and sometimes we make things worse in our urgency to make them better. Inversion gives you permission to subtract, to remove. To let things be when removal and letting be are the right approaches. Consider your schedule. The positive approach: add more productive activities, wake up earlier, use your lunch break for learning, turn commute time into podcast time, batch your tasks, optimize your calendar. Every hour should be productive. Inversion asks, what are you doing that wastes time? Meetings that could be emails that could be ignored, social obligations you attend out of guilt, projects you committed to that don't align with your actual priorities, scrolling, checking, refreshing, consuming content that leaves no trace. Remove those things and suddenly you have time. You don't need to optimize the time you have. You need to reclaim the time you're wasting. But here's where it gets interesting. Inversion also works for understanding complex systems. If you want to understand how something works, study how it breaks. If you want to understand what makes a company successful, study what makes companies fail. If you want to understand what creates strong marriages, study what destroys them. John Gottman, the relationship researcher, became famous for his ability to predict divorce with startling accuracy. He didn't do this by studying what happy couples do right. He studied what unhappy couples do wrong. He identified the 4 horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, that predict relationship failure. Couples who consistently engage in these behaviors almost always end up divorced. The intervention isn't about adding positive behaviors. It's about eliminating the 4 horsemen. Stop doing the things that kill relationships, and relationships tend to improve without elaborate relationship skills training. This is efficient. This is high leverage, because negative behaviors are often easier to identify and eliminate than positive behaviors are to implement and maintain. In writing, this shows up as kill your darlings. Good writing isn't primarily about what you include, it's about what you remove. The first draft is always too long, too indulgent, too enamored with its own cleverness. The editing process is subtraction. Remove the unnecessary words, remove the tangents, remove the parts that serve the writer's ego rather than the reader's understanding. What remains after aggressive subtraction is usually better than what you started with, even though you did less, not more. This connects to essentialism, the idea that less but better beats more but mediocre, but inversion takes it further. It's not just about doing fewer things, it's about actively identifying and removing the things that prevent you from doing what matters. Greg McKeown talks about this in his book on essentialism. Before you add anything to your life, ask, if I didn't already have this commitment, knowing what I know now, would I choose to take it on? If the answer is no, then the question becomes, how do I remove it? Most people's lives are full of zombie commitments, things they're doing only because they started doing them at some point, not because they'd choose them again today. Inversion helps you identify these zombies and kill them. In investing, inversion manifests as asking what could go wrong before asking what could go right. Every investment has a bull case, a story about how it succeeds, but the bull case is usually obvious. Everyone involved wants to tell you the bull case because they want you to invest. The bear case, the scenario where you lose money, is less discussed, but it's more important, because understanding how you could fail helps you avoid failure. Understanding what could destroy your investment helps you avoid investments that are fragile. Munger talks about this constantly. He wants to know what kills companies before he wants to know what makes them grow, because companies that are hard to kill tend to survive long enough for growth to compound. Companies that are fragile might grow explosively for a while, but eventually fragility catches up. This is antifragility, a concept Nassim Taleb built an entire framework around. Things that are fragile break under stress. Things that are robust resist stress. Things that are antifragile get stronger from stress. But you can't build antifragility by adding protective measures. You build it by removing vulnerabilities. A company with huge debt is fragile. A market downturn could destroy it. You don't make it less fragile by adding complex hedging strategies. You make it less fragile by eliminating the debt, by removing the vulnerability. A person who needs external validation is fragile. Criticism could destroy their sense of self. You don't make them less fragile by teaching them clever responses to criticism. You make them less fragile by helping them remove their dependence on external validation, by addressing the root vulnerability. Inversion reveals vulnerabilities, and once you see them, you can address them, not by building elaborate defenses, but by removing the weakness that makes defense necessary. In your daily life, this might look like, instead of trying to build willpower to resist late-night snacking, remove the snacks from your house. Instead of trying to become the kind of person who doesn't check their phone first thing in the morning, put your phone in a different room overnight. Instead of trying to force yourself to focus despite constant interruptions, remove the interruptions by closing the door and turning off notifications. You're not building capacity, you're removing obstacles. And removing obstacles is often easier than building capacity because it doesn't require sustained effort. You do it once and then the obstacle is gone. This is what James Clear calls environment design in Atomic Habits. You don't rely on willpower or motivation. You design your environment so that the right behaviors are easy and the wrong behaviors are hard. This is inversion applied to habit formation. Instead of trying to add good habits through force, you remove the friction that prevents good habits and add friction to bad habits. But inversion also works for diagnosis. When something isn't working, instead of asking, what should I add to fix this? Ask, what should I remove that's causing this? Your team isn't productive. Instead of adding productivity tools, training programs, motivational initiatives, ask, what's preventing productivity? Maybe it's too many meetings. Maybe it's unclear priorities. Maybe it's a toxic team member who drains everyone's energy. Remove the obstacle and productivity might improve without adding anything. You're not sleeping well. Instead of adding supplements, sleep tracking devices, white noise machines, ask, what's preventing sleep? Maybe it's the caffeine you drink at 3 p.m. Maybe it's the screen time before bed. Maybe it's the anxiety you're not addressing. Remove the interference and sleep might improve naturally. This is debugging. This is root cause analysis, and it's more effective than treating symptoms because it addresses why the problem exists rather than just managing its effects. In physics, this shows up in the concept of removing constraints. If you want to understand how a system behaves naturally, remove the artificial constraints and observe. The system will tell you what it wants to do when you're not forcing it to do something else. Water wants to flow downhill. Remove the dam and it flows. You don't need to teach water how to flow. You need to remove what's blocking it. People want to learn and grow. Remove the shame and judgment and arbitrary grading, and learning happens naturally. You don't need to force learning with elaborate incentive structures. You need to remove what's blocking natural curiosity. This is the genius of Montessori education. It doesn't try to force children to learn through extrinsic rewards and punishments. It creates an environment where learning is intrinsically rewarding and then removes the obstacles that prevent children from following their natural curiosity. The same principle applies to organizational culture. You don't create a great culture by adding mission statements and values posters and team-building retreats. You create great culture by removing the things that make culture toxic: unclear expectations, inconsistent leadership, tolerance of bad behavior, lack of psychological safety. Remove the toxins and culture tends to improve, because people generally want to work well together. They want to contribute. They want to be part of something meaningful, but toxic elements poison the environment and make those natural inclinations impossible to express. Inversion is also powerful for avoiding stupidity, which Munger argues is more important than pursuing brilliance. You don't need to be exceptionally smart to succeed. You just need to avoid being consistently stupid. And you avoid stupidity by identifying and avoiding the behaviors that make people stupid. What makes people stupid? Cognitive biases left unexamined, emotion-driven decision-making, overconfidence, failure to update beliefs when evidence changes, social pressure to conform, ego protection that prevents learning. You don't overcome these things by trying harder to be smart. You overcome them by building systems that prevent stupidity, checklists that ensure you don't skip important steps, decision journals that reveal your patterns, processes that slow you down when you're about to make emotion-driven choices. You invert. Instead of how do I make smart decisions, you ask, how do I avoid making stupid decisions? And the answer is usually, remove the conditions that produce stupid decisions. Don't make important decisions when you're tired, hungry, angry, or stressed. Don't make financial decisions based on fear or greed. Don't make relationship decisions when you're in the middle of conflict. These are removal strategies. You're removing the conditions that produce bad outcomes. In strategy, inversion appears as via negativa, the path of subtraction. Instead of adding strategies, you remove vulnerabilities. Instead of adding tactics, you remove what isn't working. Instead of adding complexity, you remove what's unnecessary. Steve Jobs was famous for this. When he returned to Apple, the company had dozens of product lines, all mediocre. His first move wasn't to add new products. It was to eliminate most of the existing ones. He reduced the product line to 4 quadrants: consumer, professional, desktop, laptop, and killed everything else. This was shocking. It felt reckless, but it worked because it removed the complexity that was preventing Apple from being excellent at anything. By doing less, they could be better at what remained. This is the paradox of inversion. Less is more, but only if you're removing the right things. If you're removing the essential and keeping the trivial, less is just less. So inversion requires judgment. It requires understanding what matters and what doesn't, what supports your goals and what undermines them, what adds value and what just adds noise. This is where first principles thinking and inversion intersect. First principles help you understand what's essential. Inversion helps you remove what's not. You break down the problem to its fundamentals. You identify what actually matters. Then you look at everything else and ask, does this serve what matters or does it distract from it? And if it distracts, you remove it. This creates clarity. This creates focus. This creates space for what matters to actually matter instead of being crowded out by what doesn't. What you discover when you practice inversion consistently is that many problems solve themselves when you stop creating them. That many goals become achievable when you stop preventing yourself from achieving them. That life becomes simpler when you stop complicating it. You don't need to add more. You need to remove what's in the way. The noise downstairs was just wind. The unreturned email was just busy, not malicious. The foundation you built your life on might not be the only possible foundation. And the path forward might actually be the path backward, removing what doesn't serve you until what remains is what matters. Invert, always invert. 5. Second-order thinking. You're offered a promotion, more money, more status, a better title on your LinkedIn profile. Your immediate reaction is yes, obviously yes. This is what you're supposed to want. This is what success looks like. So you take it. 6 months later, you're working 60-hour weeks. You're managing people, which means navigating politics and performance issues instead of doing the work you actually enjoyed. You're in meetings that could have been emails, responding to emails that could have been ignored, strategizing about things that don't matter to anyone outside the building. The extra money is eaten by the nicer clothes you need. The dinner's out because you're too exhausted to cook, the therapy you need to process the stress. You optimized for first-order effects, more money, better title, and ignored second-order effects, less time, more stress, work you don't enjoy. Second-order thinking is the practice of asking, and then what? It's looking beyond the immediate consequence of a decision to the consequences of those consequences. It's playing the game forward instead of just looking at the next move. First-order thinking is, I'm hungry, so I'll eat this fast food. It's cheap, it's quick, it solves the immediate problem. Second-order thinking is, I eat fast food, which makes me feel terrible an hour later, which makes me tired and unfocused, which makes me less productive, which makes me stressed, which makes me more likely to eat fast food again tomorrow. The immediate solution creates the conditions for the long-term problem. Most people are first-order thinkers most of the time. They respond to immediate incentives. They solve the problem in front of them. They take the action that feels right in the moment, and then they're surprised when things don't work out the way they expected. But the world is a system of cascading consequences. Every action creates reactions. Every solution creates new problems. Every intervention changes the landscape in ways that make the next intervention necessary or impossible. Second-order thinking is anticipating these cascades. It's understanding that the immediate effect is rarely the only effect, and often not even the most important effect. Consider antibiotics. First-order effect: they kill bacteria, cure infections, save lives. This is obviously good. But second-order effects: overuse creates antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It disrupts the microbiome. It makes infections harder to treat over time. The solution creates the conditions for worse problems down the line. This doesn't mean antibiotics are bad. It means you have to think about when to use them and when not to. You have to balance first-order benefits against second-order costs. You have to ask, and then what, before prescribing them for every minor infection. In personal finance, this shows up constantly. First-order thinking: I want this thing, I can't afford it, I'll put it on a credit card. Problem solved. Second-order thinking: now I have debt with interest, which means I'll have less money next month, which means I'll be more likely to use the credit card again, which creates a spiral that's hard to escape. The person who thinks second-order doesn't use the credit card, not because they don't want the thing, because they understand that the temporary solution creates a permanent problem. Or consider the person who stays in a bad relationship because leaving feels too hard. First-order thinking: leaving means difficult conversations, logistical complexity, emotional pain, possibly financial disruption. Staying means avoiding all of that, so they stay. Second-order thinking: staying means another year of the same unhappiness, which means another year of not finding someone compatible, which means another year of your life built on a foundation that doesn't work, which means you're making the eventual leaving harder, not easier, because now there's more shared history, more entanglement, more sunk cost. The person who thinks second order leaves, not because leaving is easy in the moment, because staying is harder over time. This is the core insight. First order thinking optimizes for the immediate. Second order thinking optimizes for the iterative. It understands that you're not making one decision. You're making a decision that creates the context for future decisions. In economics, this appears as incentive structures. Every policy creates incentives. Those incentives shape behavior. That behavior creates outcomes. And those outcomes often contradict the policy's stated goals because the policymakers only thought first order. Rent control is the classic example. First order effect: it makes housing more affordable for current tenants. This seems good. Second order effects: it reduces the incentive to build new housing, which decreases supply over time, which makes housing less affordable for everyone who's not already in a rent-controlled apartment. It creates a two-tier system where existing tenants are protected and new residents are priced out. The policy meant to solve affordable housing makes affordable housing scarcer. This doesn't mean the people who support rent control are stupid. It means they're thinking first order. They see people struggling with rent and want to help. The first order solution is to cap rent, but the second order effects undermine the goal. The person who thinks second order asks, if we cap rent, how do landlords respond? If landlords can't raise rent, do they maintain buildings? If building maintenance declines, what happens to housing quality? If returns on rental properties decline, do developers build more housing or less? What does the housing market look like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years after this policy? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary questions, because the world doesn't stop at first-order effects. In parenting, second-order thinking is the difference between managing behavior and shaping character. First-order thinking: my child is misbehaving, I'll punish them, the behavior stops. Problem solved. Second-order thinking: I punish my child, which teaches them to avoid getting caught rather than to internalize values, which means they learn to be sneaky rather than trustworthy, which means when they're older and I can't monitor them, they have no internal guidance system. The immediate behavioral compliance creates long-term moral fragility. The parent who thinks second order focuses on why the behavior happened and what the child needs to learn. This is harder in the moment. It requires conversation instead of punishment, but it builds something that lasts beyond the immediate situation. Chess players understand this instinctively. Beginners focus on the immediate: can I take this piece? Can I avoid this threat? Experts focus on position. They sacrifice pieces to gain positional advantage. They make moves that look passive but constrain the opponent's future options. They're playing moves 3, 4, 5 ahead, understanding that the board state 2 moves from now matters more than the board state right now. This is second-order thinking in its purest form. The immediate move only matters in relation to the position it creates for future moves. In business, this appears as short-term versus long-term thinking. First order, cut costs to boost quarterly earnings. Stock price goes up, executives hit their targets, bonuses get paid. Second order, cost-cutting means laying off talented people who go work for competitors. It means reducing R&D, which means no new products in development. It means cutting customer service, which means customer satisfaction declines. 2 years later, the company is less competitive, less innovative, losing market share. The quarterly earnings boost created multi-year decline. Amazon is famous for thinking second order. Bezos prioritized growth over profit for years. First order thinking says this is crazy, why would you not maximize profit? Second order thinking says, we use profit to fund infrastructure, better prices, and customer experience. That creates loyalty and market share. That creates a moat. That creates long-term value that dwarfs short-term profit. He was willing to look bad on first-order metrics because he understood second-order dynamics. In health, second-order thinking is why crash diets don't work. First order, restrict calories severely, lose weight quickly. Second order, severe restriction triggers metabolic adaptation, making your body more efficient at storing fat. It increases hunger hormones. It decreases energy, so you move less. When you inevitably return to normal eating, you gain back more weight than you lost. The quick solution made the long-term problem worse. The person who thinks second order doesn't crash diet. They make sustainable changes that account for metabolic adaptation, hormonal response, and behavioral sustainability. Slower first-order results, better second-order outcomes. This connects to inversion. Second-order thinking asks, and then what happens? Inversion asks, what could go wrong? Together, they create a framework for anticipating consequences. You're considering a decision. Second-order thinking maps out the likely cascade. I do X, which causes Y, which leads to Z. Inversion asks, at each step in that cascade, what could go wrong? What could make Y not happen as expected? What could make Z create problems I'm not anticipating? This is scenario planning. This is stress testing your decisions before you make them. This is intellectual humility, acknowledging that your first-order understanding might be incomplete. In relationships, second-order thinking prevents escalation spirals. First order, my partner said something hurtful, I'll say something hurtful back. That'll show them. Second order, I say something hurtful, they feel attacked, they escalate, I escalate. We're in a fight that has nothing to do with the original issue, we both feel terrible, the relationship is damaged. The person who thinks second order pauses. They ask, if I respond this way, where does this conversation go? They choose a response that de-escalates rather than matches energy, not because they're being weak, because they understand where escalation leads. This is impulse control informed by systems thinking. You're not suppressing your reaction because you're afraid of conflict. You're choosing a different reaction because you understand the system dynamics of conflict escalation. In technology, second-order thinking is why social media is more complicated than it initially appeared. First order, connect people, let them share, create community. This seems unambiguously good. Second order, people share outrage because outrage gets engagement. Algorithms optimize for engagement, so they surface outrage. Outrage becomes the norm. Political polarization increases. People live in filter bubbles. Democracy becomes harder. Mental health declines. The connection creates disconnection. The people who built these platforms weren't evil. They were first-order thinkers. They saw the immediate benefit, connection, and didn't anticipate the second-order effects. Or they anticipated them but didn't weigh them properly against first-order benefits. This is the trap. First-order effects are visible and immediate. Second-order effects are often invisible and delayed, so it's easy to overweight the first and underweight the second. You eat the cookie, the pleasure is immediate and certain. The health consequence is delayed and probabilistic. Your brain discounts the future consequence heavily. First-order thinking wins by default unless you consciously override it. This is why second-order thinking is a skill that requires practice. It's not natural. It's not how your brain defaults. You have to train yourself to ask, and then what? You have to build the habit of playing scenarios forward. One way to practice, decision journals. When you make a significant decision, write down what you expect to happen. First-order effects, second-order effects, third-order effects if you can see that far. Then revisit it later and compare expectations to reality. You'll discover you're wrong a lot, that's fine. The point isn't to predict perfectly. The point is to develop better intuition for how cascades work, to calibrate your understanding of which actions lead to which consequences. Over time, you get better. You start seeing patterns. You recognize that certain types of interventions reliably create certain types of second-order problems. You develop heuristics. If I do this kind of thing, that kind of consequence usually follows. This is expertise. This is what distinguishes someone who's navigated a domain for years from someone who's new. The expert has seen enough iterations to understand the cascade. They're not smarter, they're more calibrated. In policy, second-order thinking is why good intentions aren't sufficient. Every intervention into a complex system creates ripple effects. Some predictable, some not. The question isn't, does this solve the immediate problem? It's, what does the system look like after this intervention, and after people respond to this intervention, and after those responses create new conditions? Prohibition is the canonical example. First order, ban alcohol, reduce drinking, reduce alcohol-related harm. Second order, create black market, empower organized crime, increase violence, reduce quality control leading to poisonings, create disrespect for law. The intervention made the problem it was trying to solve worse while creating new problems. This doesn't mean all interventions are bad. It means you have to think about system dynamics, not just immediate effects. You have to ask how people will respond, how markets will adapt, what unintended consequences might emerge. In personal development, second-order thinking is why fake it till you make it often fails. First order, act confident, people perceive you as confident, opportunities arise. Second order, you're acting rather than developing actual competence, so when opportunities arise, you can't deliver, which undermines actual confidence, which makes you need to fake more, which creates imposter syndrome and anxiety. The person who thinks second order builds real competence first, slower, less impressive initially, but creates a stable foundation rather than a house of cards. This is also why second-order thinking pairs with patience. First-order solutions are usually fast. Second-order solutions are usually slow. You're optimizing for a different time horizon. The person who thinks first-order wants immediate results. The person who thinks second-order is willing to delay gratification because they understand that immediate results often come at the cost of long-term outcomes. This is marshmallow test thinking applied to everything, not just whether you can delay eating the marshmallow, whether you can delay the promotion, the purchase, the response, the intervention, anything, when delaying creates better outcomes down the line. In warfare, second-order thinking is strategy versus tactics. Tactics win battles. Strategy wins wars. You can win every battle and still lose the war if you're not thinking about resource depletion, morale, political support, what happens after victory. Pyrrhus won battles against Rome, but lost so many men that he couldn't continue the war. Another such victory, and I am lost, he reportedly said. This is first-order thinking, winning the immediate engagement, without second-order thinking about sustainability. The Romans, in contrast, were second-order thinkers. They lost battles regularly but won wars because they understood attrition, logistics, political structures. They thought about the state of things after the battle, after the campaign, after the generation. In your daily life, this might mean choosing the harder conversation now to avoid the worse conversation later. Choosing the less impressive job that allows for learning over the prestigious job that traps you. Choosing to exercise today, even though you're tired, because you understand what your body feels like tomorrow if you don't. These aren't dramatic decisions, but they're the decisions that compound. They're the decisions that create the conditions for future decisions. And the sum of these small second-order choices is what your life looks like years from now. What you realize when you think second-order consistently is that most regrets are first-order thinking errors. You chose the immediate gratification and ignored the delayed consequence. You solved the visible problem and created the invisible problem. You optimized the wrong variable because it was the easiest to see. Second-order thinking is correction. It's asking the harder question before the easy answer locks you into a path you'll regret. And then what? And then what? And then what? Keep asking until the answers become uncomfortable. That's usually where the truth lives. 6. Probabilistic thinking. You check the weather forecast. 70% chance of rain. You bring an umbrella but feel annoyed when it doesn't rain. They said it would rain, you mutter, as though the forecast lied to you. But they didn't say it would rain. They said there was a 70% chance, which means 3 times out of 10, even when the conditions look exactly like this, it doesn't rain. You happen to experience one of those 3 times. The forecast wasn't wrong, your interpretation was. This is the gap between how the world works and how most people think the world works. The world operates in probabilities. People think in certainties. Probabilistic thinking is the practice of reasoning in terms of likelihoods rather than absolutes. It's understanding that most things aren't guaranteed to happen or guaranteed not to happen. They're somewhere in between, and your job is to estimate where and act accordingly. This sounds obvious when stated plainly, but in practice, most people collapse probability into binary outcomes. Either it will rain or it won't. Either this investment succeeds or it fails. Either this relationship works or it doesn't. But reality doesn't work this way. Reality works in distributions, in ranges, in likelihood functions, and when you think in binary terms while operating in a probabilistic world, you make systematic errors. Consider medical testing. You take a test for a disease, the test comes back positive. Your first thought is, I have the disease. But whether you actually have the disease depends on several probabilities you probably don't know. The base rate of the disease in the population, the false positive rate of the test, and the false negative rate. Let's say the disease affects 1 in 1,000 people. The test is 95% accurate. It correctly identifies 95% of people who have the disease and correctly identifies 95% of people who don't have it. You test positive. What are the odds you actually have the disease? Most people say 95%. They're wrong. The actual probability is closer to 2%. Here's why: out of 1,000 people, on average 1 has the disease and 999 don't. The test correctly identifies the one person with the disease 95% of the time, call it once, but it also incorrectly identifies about 50 people without the disease as positive, 5% of 999. So out of roughly 51 positive tests, only 1 is a true positive. That's about 2%. This is Bayes' theorem in action. Your probability of having the disease isn't just the test accuracy. It's the test accuracy combined with the base rate, how common the disease is to begin with. Most people ignore base rates. They focus on the salient information, the test result, and ignore the background information, how rare the disease is. This is called base rate neglect, and it leads to massive errors in judgment. You meet someone at a party who's quiet and likes reading. What's more likely? They're a librarian or a farmer. Most people say librarian because the description fits the stereotype, but there are far more farmers than librarians. Even if quiet book lovers are more common among librarians percentage-wise, the sheer number of farmers means you're more likely to have met a farmer. Base rates matter. Sometimes they matter more than the specific evidence you're looking at. In your own life, this shows up when you make decisions based on vivid examples rather than actual frequencies. You hear about a plane crash and become afraid of flying, even though you drive every day and driving is far more dangerous per mile traveled. The plane crash is vivid, recent, scary. It feels probable. But the actual probability of dying in a plane crash is vanishingly small compared to the probability of dying in a car accident. Your brain isn't wired for probabilistic thinking. It's wired for pattern recognition and threat detection. A single vivid example creates a stronger impression than statistical frequency. One person you know who got sick from a vaccine creates a stronger sense of risk than the millions who were protected by it. This is availability bias. The easier something is to recall, because it's recent, vivid, or emotional, the more probable it feels, regardless of actual frequency. Probabilistic thinking is the correction. It's forcing yourself to ask, how often does this actually happen? Not how easy is it to imagine, not how scary is it when it does happen, but what's the actual frequency? If you're afraid of shark attacks, the question isn't, could a shark attack me? The answer to that is yes. The question is, how often do shark attacks happen relative to the number of people who swim in the ocean? The answer, extremely rarely. You're more likely to be killed by a vending machine or a champagne cork than by a shark. This doesn't mean sharks can't be dangerous. It means the probability is so low that it shouldn't meaningfully affect your behavior unless you're doing something unusual like swimming in shark-infested waters while bleeding. In investing, probabilistic thinking is essential. Every investment has an expected value, the probability-weighted average of all possible outcomes. An investment might have a 10% chance of returning 10 times your money, a 20% chance of doubling it, a 50% chance of modest gains, and a 20% chance of losing everything. The expected value calculation would be 0.1 times 10 plus 0.2 times 2 plus 0.5 times 1.2 plus 0.2 times 0 equals 1 plus 0.4 plus 0.6 plus 0 equals 2. So on average, you'd expect to double your money, even though the most likely single outcome is modest gains. Most people don't think this way. They focus on the best case scenario or the worst case scenario and make decisions based on whichever feels more salient. But neither extreme is the right frame. The right frame is the probability-weighted expectation across all scenarios. This is why poker players are often good at decision-making under uncertainty. They think in expected value constantly. Every hand they're calculating. Given the cards I can see, given what I know about my opponents, given the pot size, what's the expected value of calling versus folding versus raising? They know they won't win every hand. They know they'll sometimes make the right decision and lose anyway because poker is probabilistic. But over thousands of hands, making positive expected value decisions consistently produces profit, even if individual hands are unpredictable. Phil Ivey, one of the greatest poker players, says he doesn't focus on whether he won or lost a particular hand. He focuses on whether he made the right decision given the information available. If he made a decision with positive expected value and lost, that's fine. That's variance. If he made a decision with negative expected value and won, that's a problem because it means he got lucky despite making a mistake, which is dangerous because it reinforces bad thinking. This distinction between process and outcome is central to probabilistic thinking. Outcomes in probabilistic domains are partially random. You can do everything right and still lose. You can do everything wrong and still win, in the short term. But over time, over many iterations, good process beats lucky outcomes. Expected value wins. And probabilistic thinking is about aligning your decisions with expected value rather than with recent results. This is hard psychologically because your brain is an outcome processor. It judges decisions by results. If something worked out, you assume it was a good decision. If something didn't work out, you assume it was a bad decision. But in probabilistic domains, this is wrong. A decision that had a 90% chance of success that failed wasn't necessarily wrong. You just hit the 10%. A decision that had a 10% chance of success that worked wasn't necessarily right. You just got lucky. Probabilistic thinking requires you to evaluate decisions separately from outcomes. To ask, given what I knew at the time, was this a positive expected value decision? Not, did it work out? This shows up in hiring. You hire someone who interviews well, has good credentials, comes recommended. They don't work out. Was the hire a bad decision? Not necessarily. Maybe you made a reasonable bet that didn't pay off. Or maybe your hiring process is flawed and you're consistently overweighting factors that don't predict performance. You can't tell from one outcome. But if you track your hiring decisions probabilistically, what percentage of people you hire based on certain criteria end up succeeding, you can calibrate your process. You can learn which signals actually predict performance and which just feel predictive. This is Bayesian updating. You start with prior probabilities based on your best current understanding. You gather evidence. You update your probabilities. Over time, your estimates become more accurate because you're learning from frequency, not just from memorable examples. In medicine, doctors who think probabilistically are better diagnosticians. They don't just pattern match symptoms to diseases, they estimate probabilities. Given this constellation of symptoms, this age, this medical history, what's the probability of disease A versus disease B versus disease C? Then they order tests to update those probabilities. Each test result shifts the likelihood of different diagnoses. The doctor who doesn't think probabilistically jumps to conclusions based on the most salient symptoms or the most recent case they saw. They anchor on one diagnosis and ignore alternatives. They're right often enough that they don't notice the systematic errors. But the probabilistic doctor is right more often, especially on edge cases, because they're tracking likelihoods and updating them rather than committing prematurely to a single explanation. This connects back to Occam's razor and Hanlon's razor. Those principles are probabilistic claims. Occam's razor doesn't say the simplest explanation is always right. It says the simplest explanation is more likely to be right, all else being equal. Hanlon's razor doesn't say malice never happens. It says incompetence is more likely than malice, so you should start there. These are heuristics based on base rates. Simple explanations are usually correct more often than complex explanations. Mistakes are more common than malicious intent. These aren't guarantees, they're probabilistic guides. When you think probabilistically, you're always asking, what's the base rate? What's the prior probability before I consider the specific evidence in front of me? Then, how much does this new evidence shift the probability? You see someone acting strangely. Base rate, most people are not dangerous. New evidence, they're behaving erratically. Updated probability, higher than base rate but probably still low unless the erratic behavior is specifically threatening. You stay alert but don't panic. This is rational fear, not denial of risk, not overreaction to risk, proportional response to estimated risk. In policy, probabilistic thinking prevents both paralysis and recklessness. Some people see any risk and want to ban the activity. Others see benefits and ignore risks entirely. Probabilistic thinking asks, what's the probability of harm? What's the magnitude if it occurs? What's the probability of benefit? What's the magnitude if it occurs? You compare expected values. If the expected harm outweighs the expected benefit, you regulate or restrict. If the expected benefit outweighs the expected harm, you permit with appropriate safeguards. You don't make binary all or nothing decisions based on possibility. You make graduated decisions based on probability. Nuclear power is a good example. Possible harm, catastrophic, but probability of catastrophic failure in modern reactors, very low. Expected harm, low probability times high magnitude equals moderate expected harm. Expected benefit, reliable carbon-free baseload power that prevents climate change deaths and environmental damage. High probability times high magnitude equals high expected benefit. The person who thinks probabilistically might support nuclear power with strong safety regulations. The person who thinks in binaries either sees catastrophic potential and says no, or sees clean energy and says yes, without weighing likelihoods. In your personal life, probabilistic thinking helps you make better trade-offs. Should you start a business? Binary thinking, either it succeeds and you're rich or it fails and you're ruined. Probabilistic thinking, what's the distribution of outcomes? Maybe 10% chance of wild success, 30% chance of modest success, 40% chance of breaking even or small loss, 20% chance of significant loss. Now you can calculate expected value, and more importantly, you can ask, can I tolerate the loss scenarios? If the 20% significant loss would actually ruin you, then even if the expected value is positive, you shouldn't take the bet. But if you can handle the downside and the expected value is positive, the probabilistic case for trying is strong. This is Kelly criterion thinking. Bet sizes should be proportional to your edge and inversely proportional to your risk of ruin. You don't go all in on positive expected value bets if losing would destroy you. You size your bets to survive the variance. In relationships, probabilistic thinking prevents both cynicism and naivety. You meet someone new. Binary thinking, either they're perfect and this is meant to be, or they're wrong and you should move on. Probabilistic thinking, what's the probability this is compatible long-term based on what I know now? Maybe 60%. That's enough to continue investing, but not enough to ignore red flags or skip important conversations. As you gather more information, you update. The probability goes up or down based on how you interact, how they handle conflict, how aligned your values are. At some point, the probability gets high enough that deeper commitment makes sense, or it gets low enough that continuing is negative expected value. You're not trying to find certainty. You're trying to make good bets with incomplete information and update as you learn more. This also applies to self-knowledge. You're not definitively one thing or another. You're a probability distribution of possible selves depending on context, health, stress, support. Some behaviors are more likely than others, but few things about you are guaranteed. This is freeing. You don't have to defend a fixed identity. You can acknowledge that you're more likely to be patient when well rested, more likely to be creative in the morning, more likely to make bad decisions when hungry. These are probabilistic patterns, not deterministic laws. But knowing the probabilities helps you structure your life to increase the odds of being the version of yourself you prefer. Probabilistic thinking also helps with anxiety. Anxiety is often certainty about low probability negative outcomes. You're certain you'll be rejected, fired, humiliated, abandoned, but you're not certain. You're estimating probabilities badly, probably because of availability bias or negativity bias. The correction is to actually estimate probabilities. What percentage of people who do what you're about to do get rejected? What's your actual track record of being fired? How often has the catastrophe you're imagining actually occurred in your life? Usually, when you look at frequencies rather than feelings, the probabilities are much lower than your anxiety suggests. This doesn't eliminate anxiety, but it puts it in perspective. The thing you're worried about is possible, but not probable, and you can plan for low probability events without being paralyzed by them. You prepare for the possibility, have a backup plan, build in safety margins, but you don't orient your entire life around preventing something that probably won't happen. This is the serenity prayer in probabilistic form. Change what you can to improve probabilities, accept that you can't make anything certain, know the difference between the two. What probabilistic thinking gives you ultimately is calibration with reality. You stop expecting guarantees. You stop being surprised when probable things happen or when improbable things don't. You make better decisions because you're working with the actual structure of uncertainty rather than pretending it doesn't exist or being paralyzed by it. The forecast said 70%. It didn't rain. That's not a failure of prediction. That's the 30% happening. You brought the umbrella anyway because that's what you do when something is likely, even when it's not certain. And next time it's 70%, you'll bring the umbrella again, because probabilistic thinking isn't about being right every time. It's about being right more often over time. which is all anyone can ask for in an uncertain world.